So late last year, I spent some time in the office of Raymond Ackerman, one of the doyens of South African business, and he very proudly took me into his wife Wendy's office, which is right next door at the Pick n Pay head office, and showed me a massive board, probably 1 meter wide and 2 meters high, of photographs of young students that the Pick n Pay Foundation had put through tertiary education. And he told me very proudly how Nelson Mandela had been very moved by this private sector initiative, and many companies provide bursaries and opportunities for young people. I asked Raymond Ackerman in that particular interaction how many of the students on that board had paid it forward over the years, and just for a moment he blinked and went, not many, which is kind of sad when you look at the deep need for education in South Africa. Somebody who is working toward funding more sustainable education models in South Africa is former accountant. We can't ever be a former accountant, but he's an accountant, a former telecom specialist and banker, Sizwe Nxasana. The Raymond Ackerman story is quite a sad one. I mean, do you find in your experience that students today are more willing to sort of pay it forward, if you were? You get a benefit, you get a financial benefit, you get your degree, you don't then just leave everyone else in your dust. You actually come back and make a contribution, because surely that contributes to sustainability.
No, it does. It's quite interesting that a lot of people thought this young generation, the generation that's either at university today or that have just entered the world of work.
People say mean things about millennials all the time.
Yeah, but you know, there's an interesting thing about these millennials in that, you know, they are very interested in doing good. And even if they find employment, you know, often when we sit through interviews, I'm in education now, it's quite interesting how many young people are interested to get involved in something that has bigger meaning. In other words, where they can, yes, make a little bit of money, but you know, they are making a difference in other people's lives. I think we may have gone through a stage of another generation that's a little bit more senior, who are all about themselves. But certainly the younger generation, you know, I've had a lot of cases where, for instance, you know, whether it is the National Education Collaboration Trust, where we have the private sector with unions and government working with the Department of Basic Education, where we have a lot of young people who volunteer their time to go and help in a lot of, you know, schools that are needy and so on. But even in private schools, you know, I'm involved with private schools, and I get a lot of young professional people who just want to come and talk to, you know, young students that are in the system and so on, again, for nothing. So I think there's a different culture with the millennials, with the young people that are in the system today.
We certainly hope so, because in order to create a sustainable environment, we need the loop to be closed. Part of that loop is the problem of basic education. So kids go into school, many kids get to the age of 8 and can't read with any level of comprehension, get to matric and only scrape through or don't scrape through. Half of the kids who get some sort of matric pass at the end of this year, for example, there'll only be half of the kids who enrolled 12 years ago. We've got a crisis in basic education, which then spills over, as you mentioned earlier, into the high dropout rates. And we keep talking about how we need to fix every aspect of education in order to make it work better into the future. Are we putting those building blocks in place? Do the kids who go matriculate 12 years from now have a better chance than the kids who are matriculating this year?
I think we are. You know, there are a number of things that are happening in the basic education system. We all know that the first 1,000 days of any child is the most important in their brain development, in their cognitive development and so on. One of the major decisions that the government has made is to move the Early Childhood Development Unit, which was sitting or still sitting in the Department of Social Development, to basic education. Because, you know, and as I often say, we've got to stop thinking of early childhood development in the context of social welfare, which is also important. Think of it in the context of basic education and the development of the brains, and therefore access to education at that early age being really important. And international studies like the Thames or PILS that South Africa participates in show us that, you know, if children are exposed to early childhood development at an early age, it has a major impact on their reading for meaning, on their numeracy, and even just their cognitive development overall. And if you look at basic education system itself, there are a number of things that the Department of Basic Education is doing that a lot of people may not even know about. There's a process, for instance, of looking at 21st century learning and teaching. We all talk about the fourth industrial revolution today. So the National Education Collaboration Trust, with which I'm involved, which brings business, labor, civil society to work with the Department of Basic Education, is already piloting what the new CAPS curriculum is going to look like, which includes computing and robotics, but also particularly all the new skills or the skills that are required. Because going forward, especially with the fourth industrial revolution, not only do schools have to impart knowledge, which is important, but must also develop the skills such as communication, critical thinking, collaboration, and so on, which are particularly important in the context of the 21st century. So there's already a process of looking at the curriculum in basic education to introduce those. We all know that mathematics, especially if we're going to grow our STEM, is particularly important. And this is an area where working with higher education institutions that produce teachers, the Funza Lushaka Bursary Program has been one of the major contributions that the state is making in producing the quantity of teachers, but also the quality of teachers that are required to teach in our schools. And there's a pipeline now of almost 30,000 students that are doing teaching, whether it's undergraduate or postgraduate at universities, that are funded by the Basic Education Department. And there are other things, for instance, that are happening in that system, which are looking at improving the quality.
I mean, it's so important. I remember talking to Chris Becker a couple of years ago when he was still chief executive at ISFAP before he became chairman. I said, why do you put so much money into research and development in places like India? Why don't you do research and development in your home country of South Africa?
Yeah.
Bottom line was, he can't find the people to do the stuff that he needs to do at an affordable price, simply because the Indian approach to education has been so fundamentally different to ours.
Yeah, so, I mean, research, you talk about research and being part of innovations and entrepreneurship and so on. These are some of the things that are now being addressed. For instance, if you just take the curriculum that I talked about in basic education, there's now an introduction of entrepreneurship in basic education curriculum, of leadership, because leadership can be taught. That's why you have business schools that teach leadership. But also, one of the things that we are looking at in the private sector particularly, bearing in mind that the National Student Financial Aid Scheme does not fund a lot of postgraduate students, honors, masters, doctoral or postdoctoral students, we are mobilizing the private sector to be able to fill that gap. Because if you talk about research, and everybody talks about black tax, that we find a lot of students who come from poor and working class backgrounds graduate but do not proceed to do postgraduate studies. And that's where a lot of research actually comes in. By mobilizing the private sector, we want to fill that gap.
I want to find out exactly how you're going to fill that gap, because you've moved on from ISFAP and you've now moved on into a more private sector initiative, getting banks involved, getting them on board, getting some private sector funding into the mix in order to try and address this very, very complicated and expensive issue of how you take a cohort of young South Africans, train and skill them to a point where they make a valuable contribution to a growing South African economy. It's easy to say, but hard to do. Sizwe Nxasana is tackling that very, very complex issue. How he's doing it in a moment.